Good evening. I'm Jacob Hornberger, and this is the Jacob Hornberger Show. I'm president of the Future of Freedom Foundation at fff.org. And I thought I'd talk to y'all this evening about the massacre that took place in Connecticut of all those children and I think it was 4 adults. And of course, this is what the gun control crowd does, and they seize upon an opportunity to get their agenda in. I mean, and I've said this in the past that all we need is one giant catastrophe like this, and the gun control crowd is just going to pounce and say, "Well, this is what we need. We need gun control in America." And I thought I'd deal with the superficial arguments, fairly quickly. I mean, it gets so tiresome to make the same arguments over and over again. But the gun control crowd knows their arguments are ridiculous. I mean, they want gun control, but the arguments that support that are so ridiculous. But we have to address them. We have to keep repeating them ad infinitum because there's still people that are swayed by these ridiculous arguments. Um, First of all, they say, well, if we pass a gun control law, criminals would obey the law, and therefore you wouldn't have this kind of massacre because it'll be against the law for people to take guns into a public school. Well, it is against the law. I mean, that's what's so ridiculous about this whole thing. I've said this in the past, but let me emphasize it. Murderers don't give a hoot about gun control laws. Okay? I mean, I don't know what we need to do to make that just settle in to the brain of the gun control crowd. That they honestly think this, that if you just make it illegal for a murderer, to own a gun, that all would-be murderers are going to obey the law. Well, it's ridiculous. If a person's going to commit murder, he doesn't care what the gun control law is. Here's a perfect example. I mean, surely it's illegal in Connecticut to carry guns into a public government school, right? But the man violates the law. He doesn't give a hoot. So what is the real downside to these laws? Well, they disarm people from defending themselves because most law-abiding people are not going to risk a felony conviction or even if it's just a misdemeanor. Usually there's about a year of jail attached to that. Nobody wants a criminal record. And so most people, not everyone, but most people are going to obey the law. And so what you've really done is you've disarmed people from defending themselves against the murderers who don't obey the law. And I don't see why that is not clear to every gun control person. Again, the murderer doesn't obey the law. The people who could defend themselves against the murderer, they do obey the law. So effectively, the law disarms them. Now, the other fantasy of the gun control crowd, in addition to murderers obeying gun control laws, is that they can wipe out any guns in society, or any type of guns, like the AR-15 that was used in this case, or the 9mm Glock, or Sig Sauer, that somehow or another they can pass a law and it'll effectively click a switch that poof, all the guns disappear except those in the hands of the government, the federal government, and the state police and the local police. In other words, only those guns in the hands of the government will be permitted to be in existence. All the others will poof, disappear. See, their idea is, in their ideal world, it's sort of like Cuba. I mean, in Cuba, there's no guns in Cuba. And so that's what their ideal world, well, except for the government. See, the Cuban government's got a monopoly over the ownership of guns. Civilians don't have any guns. And so, the statists can say, oh, well, look, the murder rate's really low in Cuba, because there's no guns. Well, that's possible, but I'm sure that if somebody wants to commit a murder, there's other ways. I mean, there's knives and there's, baseball bats or what have you. But the fact is that they're not going to make guns disappear. It's just a fantasy of theirs. You've got millions and millions of guns in existence, and you've got them on the international market. You got manufacturers producing them. I mean, you've got millions and millions of guns. And so let's assume you make them illegal. Let's just say you make assault rifles illegal. Well, does that mean that the murderer is not going to be able to get an assault rifle? Well, is the murderer able to get cocaine? I mean, that's illegal. Marijuana, that's illegal. I mean, if you like the war on drugs with all the violence and the robberies and the muggings and the gang wars and the cartels, you will love the war on guns, because now once you make it a black market, you have the same thing you do with the drug war. All of a sudden you've got gangs forming, you've got people selling guns on the black market, you got people robbing to pay for the exorbitant price of guns on the black market. You will have an absolute enormous mess, and you will not deprive the would-be murderer of the gun because he can get it. Just like he can get marijuana or cocaine. You may have to pay a little bit more for it. But this notion that they can convert America into Cuba, where only the government has guns and that all the guns have disappeared from American society, is ridiculous. The cat's out of the bag. I mean, this country, people have owned guns for, since the founding of the republic, and so you're not going to get guns to disappear. I mean, I guess maybe they might have this fantasy that they're going to use the government to go into everybody's home and conduct a search with metal detectors and stuff, but that's not going to happen. And so you end up again, with a worse situation than you have today. Now, does that mean that nothing can be done? I saw where one commentator today, a gun control advocate, said something like, well, it's a non-starter to talk about whether those kids should have guns to defend themselves. They were in the first grade and fourth grade. Ha, ha, ha. Ridiculous, Well, that's ludicrous. Nobody's saying that fourth graders should be permitted to have guns. But it might have been quite a bit different if, yes, a school teacher had had a gun or a principal had had a gun. You might be able to hold off the murder a little bit. But I think we need to go to a deeper level here, because, obviously some people don't want to send their kids to a school where the principal's carrying or the teacher is carrying. And yet, what's a choice here? And now I'm going to shift grounds here because I'm going to talk about something that I guarantee you no status is going to talk about, and that's public government schools. Now, the reason they're not going to talk about it is because in their world, in the world of statism, public schooling is a given. It is an established part of America, just like it's an established part of Cuba and North Korea and China and Russia. And so don't even go down the road of questioning that this was a government school where this happened, you see. And I mean, they won't do it because their mindsets have, they're in a status box, as I've said before. They're inside the status box. They call it freedom. The troops are defending our freedoms, our public government schools and so forth. And, you just can't break through a status mind that just sees public schools as given. But the libertarian mind is different. We've broken free of the statism. We're not in the status box. I mean, we're living in a status society, but our mindsets exist over and above the status system because we don't agree with it. We think it's wrong. Now, notice how this public government school system works. Everybody is mandated by law to send his kid into these institutions. Okay. Now, you can say, well, Jacob, there's alternatives. There's private schools and there's homeschooling. Yeah, but they're really distorted alternatives because, the market is so limited for, let's say, private schools that you got to have a lot of money to send your kids to private school. Now, some people can do it. But many times they're just mirror images of the public school. They're licensed. If they don't, comport to a certain, quote, standard, they know they can have their license revoked, which means they go out of business. So they still got to please the state, and they know it, and the state knows it. And then so a lot of people just can't afford it. I mean, especially after they've paid the school taxes. They're saying, well, gosh, I got to pay double. I got to pay the school taxes, and then I got to go pay the, $25,000 tuition for each of their children. And so it's not really a viable alternative in this tightly controlled educational market, because in order to start a private school, you need to get that license. And that's not an easy thing to get. You got certifications and all this other stuff. Now, the other thing is homeschooling, and certainly that is an alternative, but it's not an alternative to a lot of people, at least as a practical alternative. Some people just don't feel competent when it comes to education. They'd rather hire somebody to do the educating because in the division of labor, they figure that a school teacher can do the job better than they can. Uh, there's also the time elements. People just say, look, we need to work, two-family income and whatever, and we just can't afford to give up the one income to stay home educating the children. So for a very, very large segment of society, there is really just one alternative, and that's the public government school system. And that's a mandatory obligation. I mean, the state imposes this obligation by force. If you don't send your kids into these institutions, you will be sent to jail. They will come and get you. They will haul you before a judge. They will threaten to take your child away. And if you persist, they will take your child away because you're an incompetent parent. At least that's the way they look at it. And so, I don't know what the number is, but I would, if I had to hazard a guess, I would say 80% of people simply cannot afford private schools and cannot, for whatever reason, engage in homeschooling. Maybe it's even higher. But all those people that fall into that category have their kids in this government school system. Now, imagine it's a gun-free zone, and so when you look at this thing objectively, you can see that people are being forced by the state to send their kids into an institution where everybody's disarmed, and the parent doesn't have a choice. I mean, he doesn't have a choice between this public school where the people are able to arm themselves and this public school where they're not able to arm themselves. He's got to go to the school district in which his home is located, and that just happens to be a gun-free zone, and parents don't have any choice in the matter. Now, hardly anyone thinks about this except libertarians. I mean, you don't see any outrage of why should the state have the power to mandate people to send their kids, these prized, things that they've created, they've brought into existence, their children, and why should the state have the authority to force the parent to send their children into this gun-free zone where they're essentially defenseless? And how many people ask that question? Why should the state force my children into these gun-free zones? It's not fair. It's not right. And yet that's exactly what's happening. Every one of those children that were in this public school were there by law. They were forced there into an institution that's a gun-free zone where people do not have the ability to defend these children. And so, well, you might ask me, well, Jacob, does that mean that you favor that people in public schools, the administrators, the teachers and everything, should be required to carry guns or should be permitted to carry guns? Or no, I'm not saying that at all. I mean, it's one thing we've always said at the Future of Freedom Foundation. We're not going to tell the government how to run its system, its government school system. Where should there be uniforms in public schools? Should there be, searches of the lockers? It's all just nonsense because it's the system itself that is aberrant. It is the system itself that is dysfunctional. I mean, imagine they're using force, coercion, to educate a person. I mean, it's plain right there how wrong this is. How can you force somebody to learn something? And yet that's what they do. You see, that's why public government schooling is really a cramming process. They're cramming information into the heads of these students, and they're indoctrinating them. There's no other way to put it. I mean, they're indoctrinating them with all the standard nonsense that the troops are overseas defending our rights and our freedoms. We wouldn't be free if they weren't over there. Oh, the welfare state is freedom. And the government's here to take care of you. Social Security, there's a giant trust fund there. I mean, that's part of being in this government system. I mean, effectively, public schooling is like the Army. I mean, they're effectively drafting the children from time they're 6 years old into coming into this government institution to have information crammed into their head and have their mind molded into what it could commonly be called the good little citizen. The good little citizen that carps about this administration or that rule or that bureaucracy or that bureaucrat, but never is able to challenge things at a fundamental level because his mind has been molded so well over those 12 years of government molding that he doesn't even think about it. And then he sees somebody like a libertarian and he thinks, oh gosh, what is that? That's a person that's thinking. That's a person that's critically analyzing. That's a person who's challenging. Oh my gosh. And they get terrified of libertarians because they know that that's what their mind is not able to do. And so it's an aberrant system. You're using coercion. I often wonder, somebody ought to do a study in terms of psychology of how much damage is done to people by virtue of force being employed against them from the time they're 6 years old to the time they're 18. I mean, I'll tell you one thing, that when you see children up to the time they're 6 years old, their eyes are this big. I mean, they've got this awe of the universe. You can see it in a newborn kid, He just looks around and he's just absorbing everything. He's so darn fascinated with life. And then by the time he's able to talk, he'll bedevil. Every kid bedevils his parents. Why? 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 I mean, he wants to know. He's like inquisitive. He's curious. He's got this wonder of life. And by the time he's 18, that's smashed out of him. I mean, it's just like the army, I mean, it's just, you're taught not to think. You're taught to just, do, respect authority, don't question anything. And it's impossible, I think, to overstate how much damage. And, part of it, you see all this drug war business. I mean, what they're really saying with the drug war is that there's a gigantic drug problem. And guess what? Most of those people with this drug problem are graduates of public schools. I mean, how can coercion against a kid not have an adverse effect? Seizing him, effectively drafting him, where his parents have to take him to the school bus and so forth. How much damage that must do. And what good's it do? People say, oh, well, my parents would never get educated and I would never get educated if it hadn't been for public schools. Really, well, how educated are you? The state won't even trust you with educating your own children. They don't think you're competent. Remember that homeschooling is a relatively new phenomenon. Back in up to at least the 60s and most of the 70s, I think, homeschooling was illegal because they felt that parents weren't competent to do this. And of course, why not? Aren't all those parents graduates of public schools? Why have they produced so many incompetent parents then? But anyway, you've got this dysfunctional system that mandates that people send their kids in this thing. And it's not a coincidence that public schooling is one of the pride and joys of Fidel Castro's Cuba. I mean, yeah, same system. Remember when they were battling over that kid Elian? It was really a battle over which state was going to have the ability to indoctrinate him, to mold his mind. And now the kid's part of the communist youth and he's all proud of Fidel Castro. Well, sure, because he had his mind molded for him. But if he had been over here in an American public school, he'd be saying, oh, CIA's great, military-industrial complex great. Oh, we had to invade Iraq because WMDs were about to fall on America. I mean, he'd be repeating all the same nonsense. Oh, they're in Iraq spreading freedom and democracy, in Afghanistan doing the same thing. I mean, it's an aberrant, dysfunctional system. And oh, by the way, it's a socialist system. Yeah, public government schooling, you would have a difficult time finding a better example of a socialistic program than that. I mean, you could point to the Army. The Army is as Milton Friedman pointed out. In fact, you can Google that, Milton Friedman, Army Socialism, and you see what he said about the Army. I mean, like the Army, the public school system is a top-down command and control system. It's funded by force through taxes, not consumer satisfaction. Government does the textbooks, government school teachers, government program, and follow all the rules, and I mean, it's a variation of the Army. And so now, so if we're not going to say as libertarians, oh, well, the school teachers should be armed and whatever, and really, we don't get into that at the Future of Freedom Foundation. What's the alternative here? Well, the alternative is a total free market in education, and we've been arguing that for years. One of the best books we have is called Separating School and State: How to Liberate America's Families. It's our bestseller by far of all the books we have. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's by Sheldon Richman, our vice president at FFF and editor of the Future of Freedom Journal. And what we call for is a total separation of school and state, just like we have a separation of church and state. We don't have government mandating that people send their kids to church, do we? We don't have, taxation funding the churches. Why not the same system in education, a total free market where, consumers are looking out in the marketplace and seeing what's available, and you got all these entrepreneurs vying for consumer businesses. No more licensing of schools. Just let the market blossom. I mean, look, you can get a hint of what life's like, like in the grocery business. Look at all the grocery stores that vie for your business. Around here we got Safeway, Harris Teeter, Giant, international food stores, 7-Eleven. It's incredible, and they're all fighting to get your business. And that's the way it would be in education. I mean, entrepreneurs would be out there vying, and you'd be free to treat each of your children in a different way. It wouldn't be this cutter mentality, cookie cutter mentality, where everybody's got to be treated the same, like in public schools. Is that you could treat this kid different from this kid and this kid. And then, if you choose schools, you have a variety of schools. You got schools where the principals are armed, the teachers are armed. You got schools where they're not. All right. Now, all of a sudden, all the political battles have fallen out. I mean, they're gone. They've disappeared. Why? Because everybody can send his kid to whatever school he wants to send him to. If you want to send them into a gun-free school zone, great. No problem. You want to send them into a school where people are free to defend themselves against murderers? Great. But that's the virtues of a market economy. If you don't like what a grocery store's selling, they're not selling enough organic, oh, you go over here to Whole Foods, I mean, that's what choice is out. This is what freedom of choice is all about. And that way, we would solve at least the problem with respect to people having a right to defend themselves. Not by virtue of, hey, let's go to the state and mandate that all public school administrators should have guns, no. Just finally get to a point where acknowledge that the socialist system, it hasn't worked. It's immoral. I mean, not even the president subjects his children to the public school system, and I don't criticize him for that. I mean, it's a little bit hypocritic when he's out there praising public schools, but I don't fault him for that because it shows he values his children. He has a choice. He's got the money to send them into these expensive private schools in Washington, D.C. But if all of a sudden you opened up in the marketplace, everybody could afford education at some degree and some level. And again, the entrepreneurs would be rushing in to satisfy the demand of the middle class, the poor. You'd have, churches providing education or workplace schools where people take their kids to work and they've got the school right there. And all things that we can't even imagine, because that's what the free market does. It brings into existence things that we can't even imagine. So now let me address finally. Let me wrap things up with this gun control thing. The thing that we always have to remember is that in every dictatorship, most every dictatorship, the government has a monopoly over guns, and you see this in Latin American history a lot. I just got through reading a book on Guatemala and the CIA coup in 1954 there, and Jacobo Arbenz was the Democratic elected president, and the U.S. didn't like him because he was a communist sympathizer, and so that apparently gives them the authority to either go oust him from power like they had done with Mossadegh in Iran the year before, or assassinate him as they tried to do with Castro. Now remember, Arbenz never attacked the United States. I mean, it would be ridiculous, the Guatemalan army to attack the United States. It's so ludicrous, the notion. But that's what was going on with these Cold War national security types. They thought, oh my gosh, what if Guatemala unites with the Cuban army and this Nicaragua or whatever, and they've got these dark fantasies, all of which are just ludicrous. I mean, this guy was a communist sympathizer. He believed in a lot of what Franklin Roosevelt was doing, confiscating gold, nationalizing gold, redistribution of wealth. But he was more open. He was sympathizing with communism, and but I mean, he certainly had no intentions of invading the United States. Ridiculous. Well, when the CIA, got their little rebel army together, and the rebel army was coming, it was clear that the Guatemalan army could wipe them out. But the citizenry wanted to fight. They wanted to protect their nationalism, much like the Cuban people wanted to protect their nationalism. But they didn't have guns. And the Guatemalan army would not permit the president to distribute guns to the citizenry to help defend their country from this attack. And then what ends up happening is the Guatemalan army got scared that the American army was going to follow on the heels of this rebel army, and they didn't want to fight the American army. And they'd been, a lot of them had been trained at the School of the Americans and stuff, and they shivered. I mean, they actually scared of facing the U.S. Army, and so they went and told Arbenz, "Time for you to resign." And so, I mean, my point is that in Latin America, governments, the armies have the monopoly of control over the guns, the ownership, and in that kind of case, shows you what can happen when a foreign nation invades the country and there's nothing you can do. I mean, compare that to Switzerland, where everybody's armed to the teeth. You don't see any massacres there. Isn't that interesting? But people are well armed. Why? Because they're prepared to defend their country. And then there's also the final reason is that whenever you've got a government that's got the monopoly over the ownership of guns, that's the recipe for tyranny. I mean, that's the recipe where the army takes control in a coup, or the president behaves as a dictator. They start rounding people up, torturing them, raping them, abusing them. And the nice thing about gun ownership is it provides a discouragement to that. The government says, "Hey, maybe we better not take a chance." But when they got a monopoly over guns, they say, "Why shouldn't we take the chance? We've got to protect our country from the communists and the terrorists and, the stuff that dictators use." And our founding fathers understood this. That's the whole idea of the right to keep and bear arms, not just because of private property, but this was the resistance to tyranny. And one of the best expositions on this, go take a look at a legal case called Silveira versus Lockyer, Silveira versus Lockyer. And Judge Kaczynski in there, read his opinion. It is fantastic. He says that once you disarm the citizenry, that's a mistake that people make only once. Because once they disarm, then the government's got them. Then the First Amendment and all the other amendments, all the other rights, they're gone, because the government knows that people don't have the ability to stop the tyranny. And that's what Kaczynski's saying. He says it's a mistake you make only once, and that's it. Well, that's not a mistake we want to make. And people say, "Oh, well, that could never happen in this country." Well, you just don't know. I mean, you don't know what the situation could bring. Dwight Eisenhower said that the military-industrial complex posed a grave threat to our democratic processes. John Kennedy, he was concerned about a military coup with the strong power that the military and the military-industrial complex and the CIA had as far back as '63. He was concerned about a coup. And he expressed that. I mean, in fact, one of the reasons the movie 7 Days in May got made is because Kennedy said, "I want that movie made to serve as a warning to the American people of the dangers of this huge apparatus that's been put into place." And then, 30 days after the Kennedy assassination, President Truman publishes an op-ed in the Washington Post saying the CIA has become a dark and sinister force in American life. And so you don't know what the situation would bring. But one thing's for sure is that the right to keep and bear arms, which doesn't come from the Constitution, it's a natural, God-given right that pre-exists the Constitution, it serves as an insurance policy. It keeps would-be tyrants at bay and makes them think twice. Because once they have the monopoly, as Judge Kaczynski says, that's a mistake that's only made once. So for these reasons, well, let me say one final thing. About a year ago, after the Columbine shootings. I wrote an article saying, we're living in a society, thanks to the national security state, that has a culture of death and violence. We've become it seeps through us in our skin, our pores. Every day we hear about dropping bombs on this wedding party or kill these number of children. And the military, in Afghanistan, Iraq, and there's just this sort of callousness of these, oh, they're just Pakistanis, or they're just Iraqis, or just Afghans, and then always the common regrets. But it's just become part of our life now. All these kids that are killed, and people are killed, the sanctions that were against Iraq that killed hundreds of thousands of people, children. And Madeleine Albright saying that, she was the ambassador to the United Nations, saying that the deaths of 500,000 children are worth it, worth a regime change. That's what she obviously meant. And so you've got this perpetual war on terrorism that the national security state has foisted upon us. And so we've got to go deeper on this thing. And you all have heard me question the whole idea of the national security state, the vast military industrial complex, the vast military empire, the CIA, because that's what comes with this cancerous apparatus that's been engrafted onto our body politic. That's what we need to do. We need to go down and pull this junk out by its roots. We need radical surgery, okay, that excises the cancer. And that's the socialism, the imperialism, the interventionism, including the drug war. So you get rid of the warfare state, you get rid of the welfare state, you get rid of the government schooling, and now you're talking about a harmonious, peaceful, prosperous society, the kind of society that we deserve, that we're entitled to, not this aberrant, dysfunctional society that's filled with violence and massacres, where people are, getting on edge and doing these weird things. And we don't need to live in a society like that, but we need to understand, what there is out there in terms of diminishing the propensity of people to do that. And that's where libertarianism comes in. Doesn't solve all the problems. Sure, there's still going to be some bad people in the world, plenty of bad people, but it does restore that sense of balance to human life, of harmony and prosperity, and just, mutual cooperation, voluntarism. Anyway, that's the show. I won't be here next week. 2 weeks from now, I'll be back with you. Thanks for listening in, and you guys have a very Merry Christmas.